We're back in the FITSNews studio for another edition of the Week in Review. We got a lot to cover, folks. I'm going to try to avoid the black helicopter trap, covering the Murdaugh case and some new developments on the sentencing side. We're going to go into our new FITSFILES podcast with an excerpt from the Rose Petal murder. You won't want to miss that story. And last but not least, we're going to talk about a case of congressional blue balls. That's right. All that and much more heading your way on the Week in Review. All right, so we're starting with the Murdaughs this week, and we are moving into the accountability phase of this story. With a lot of these stories we cover, you've got the crime, you've got the aftermath, you've got the investigation, you've got all these different components, the prosecution. And we have gone through all those phases on so many of the facets of this Murdaugh murders, crime and corruption saga that has just dominated certainly our work here at FITSNews for the last few years, but we're moving now into that accountability phase. And we talked about it some last week regarding the big civil settlement in the largest wrongful death case tied to this saga. We talked about the apportionment of blame, and we're seeing that civilly, we're seeing it criminally. We certainly saw it back in March when Alec Murdaugh, who was at the epicenter of this multifaceted, multi-layered, generational scandal, received 2 life sentences from a South Carolina Circuit Court judge, Clifton Newman, for the murder of his wife and younger son down in Colleton County on June 7, 2021. That was sort of the biggest moment. We're going to talk a little bit about that verdict here in a minute, but first, we're going to talk about a verdict in the federal court system that was handed down last November against Russell Laffitte. Laffitte, 52 years old, from Hampton, South Carolina. He's the former president of Palmetto State Bank, which was a key cog in the financial schemes that were perpetrated by Murdaugh and a band of co-conspirators, alleged co-conspirators in some cases. In Laffitte's case, a convicted co-conspirator. But this was the fleecing, the theft of millions of dollars from former Murdaugh clients and others, which, according to state prosecutors in that big double homicide trial, led up to the murders, were the motive, really, for Murdaugh's decision to kill his wife and younger son, that the financial strain that he was facing and the threat of imminent exposure. We heard all about that at the trial, but Laffitte was a key cog in those financial scams. And I got to tell you, the federal prosecutors in that case, so those of you who were down there and watched it for yourself, or those of you who read our coverage, spearheaded by Dylan Nolan, our special projects director, or you watched it on other outlets perhaps, you know for a fact that the case against Laffitte was a tour de force by those prosecutors. Emily Limehouse, Winston Holliday, Kathleen Stoughton. They did amazing work, just methodically documenting how Laffitte broke the law on numerous occasions to help Murdaugh steal and to cover it up. So it was open and shut. And so not only was Russell Laffitte guilty, but his guilt was proved beyond a reasonable doubt. And he's going to face the music this coming week in Charleston, South Carolina. Sentencing hearing has been scheduled in U.S. District Court down there in Charleston. And Laffitte is facing anywhere from 9 to 11 and a half years. And I real quick want to say a quick note regarding our sources, because when this story first broke, you had a lot of folks talking about these charges and how much time he was facing. And a lot of folks were talking about how he was facing 180 years in a federal pen, perhaps 200 years, That's not the way the system works, folks. What they do is they take that longest sentence on that crime and they do them concurrently. So it's basically a 30-year max that Laffitte is facing. So it's not 180 years, not 200 years. It's 30 years max. But as our sources said at the time, and again, I want to shout out to our sources. We got great sources here. They said it would be between 8 and 14 years. And sure enough, when that U.S. District Court sentencing guideline was posted, the recommended incarceration time for Laffitte is between 9 and 11.5 years. So our sources got it right in the middle of that window. So how much time is he going to serve, though? Likely every bit of the high end of that, because in a pre-sentencing memo that was released just this past week, federal prosecutors pulled no punches. They talked about Laffitte's refusal to cooperate at every step of this. And let's remember, this includes reneging on a plea deal. Laffitte had a deal. He was going to plead guilty, testify against Murdaugh and others. He was going to get about 4 to 5 years in the pen, but that was the deal he had reached. But he reneged on it, and as a result, now facing twice that time. Prosecutors also pointed out Laffitte attempted to influence the jury with his YouTube videos, which were released on the eve of the trial and one during the trial, where he attempted to frame his conduct in a favorable light, very ineffectively, I would add. But as we ponder this, I want to go back because there's something that's important to be raised here, and this is going to tie into the Murdaugh verdict too. Russell Laffitte's verdict was not without controversy. There was an 11th hour change in jurors. 2 jurors were kicked off by District Court Judge Richard Gergel. And again, this is elemental to our system of justice. As I've said before, there's no doubt Laffitte was guilty as sin. And not only that, there was no doubt that the prosecutors proved his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. But the process still matters, people. And the process dictates that you must have the unanimous verdict of a jury of your peers to convict you. Now, that happened in the Laffitte case, but not without some very last-minute, questionable jury moves by Judge Richard Gergel. And I want to talk about this because, we deal sometimes with the realm of black helicopters and conspiracy theories, and I'll talk briefly about that in a sec. But in the Laffitte case, you had a juror who said they were being pressured to change their view. That same juror also indicated that they were on a time constraint to take some medicine that they needed to take. But Gergel wasn't having any of that. And I want to, at this point, remind our readers that all this was happening literally the day before the Thanksgiving holiday, the Thanksgiving break. And I also want to remind readers that this condensed time frame that was pushing everyone to try to get to a verdict so quickly before Thanksgiving, part of it was due to the fact that Gergel canceled an entire day of the trial so he could go up to D.C. and rub elbows with some Supremes, which, again, I understand. But, again, the process matters. Every step of this matters. And whether or not this case is tossed on appeal, let's assume for a second it is, I have absolutely no doubt that any other jury in the world is going to find this guy guilty if it has to be retried. And I don't think it will be retried, but if it is, again, no doubt in the verdict. Laffitte, guilty of sin, was proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and will no doubt be proven beyond a reasonable doubt again if necessary. But why open that door? And as I thought about this, it also led me to think about the Murdaugh verdict. Because if you recall, the Murdaugh verdict, the day the verdict was issued, the morning it was issued, one of those jurors was excused. Judge Clifton Newman removed her. She was called the Egg Lady, if you remember. And she got that name because when Newman was kicking her off and asked her, hey, you got anything in the jury room you need to get? She said, 12 eggs. And everybody had a chuckle at that, but she was a hard no, people. She was not convinced of Alec Murdaugh's guilt. In fact, not only was she not convinced, she was so dead set, according to our sources, she would have hung that jury. She would have hung that jury, which of course means prohibit it from being unanimous, resulting in a mistrial. Imagine for a second if that case had ended in a mistrial. Imagine for a second if Laffitte's case had ended in a mistrial. Now, there's no tinfoil in this hat. Contrary to some of the folks that, they say sometimes, I am at least sympathetic to tinfoil hattedness. I will at least indulge conspiracy theories. But here's the thing. Here's why this is important. Is because when corners are cut, when things are not done, well, again, and some will say in these cases 100% by the book, but These last-minute jury moves open the door for, again, the crazies on Reddit, whatever you want to say, to try to poke holes in the integrity of the case. And to me, that's the real issue, is why make unnecessary mistakes when you can get to justice without them? And again, some would contend they weren't mistakes. We don't know the exact details of the investigation into the egg lady. We know what we think we know about the reasons for her removal. But that flipped that verdict, people. It flipped that verdict. And the removal of the Laffitte jurors may have flipped that verdict too. And in a world where everything is under the microscope, where people can easily say, oh, well, look, these two verdicts, they were trying to tie this thing up. They had to get these verdicts to make sure the other guilty parties, and I don't know if there are other, we do believe this is bigger than Alec Murdaugh. It's clearly bigger than Murdaugh. But those who argue that a broader criminal network is being protected and that others are being allowed to evade justice because of these jury moves, they can point to this. Do I think they're right? No. I do not. I think the removal of the egg lady was proper. And I think the situation in the federal system, while questionable, clearly wasn't going to change the outcome. And I sure as hell don't believe those two things are related. But again, in a system that is so strapped right now for public faith, for public confidence, why make an unforced error? That's my point. But again, as we talk about this jury, I want to shift gears here real quick before I do start putting tinfoil in the hat. And I want to talk to somebody who had a front row seat to that jury, who knew more about what that jury was thinking than anybody else. And I'm talking about Colleton County Clerk of Court Becky Hill. Miss Becky, for those of us who were covering that trial, ran an unbelievable ship during the 6 weeks that we were all in Colleton covering that case. The attorneys, the media, court staff, everybody swore by Miss Becky and the way that she ran those proceedings. She's published a new book. It's called Behind the Doors of Justice, which details her experiences during that trial. And as I read that book, one of the things that stood out to me was the insight she had into that jury. How she knew the moment that Alec Murdaugh's fate was sealed. And as she recalled in her book, here is an excerpt from my conversation with Colleton County Clerk of Court, Becky Hill. Let me ask you this question. One of the things that struck me in reading your book was the insight you had into that jury. It was almost like you knew from the very beginning what they were thinking. And remember, a lot of folks don't know this, but Alec Murdaugh picked that jury himself, didn't he?
He did. Defendants sometimes get the chance to do that. Sometimes they exercise their right to do that. And Alec Murdaugh certainly did use his right to pick his own jury. My daughter almost was on the jury as well.
Oh, wow. Now, that would have been some insight.
That would have been a totally different story.
You wrote in your book, though, about sometimes juries come together, sometimes they don't. But you wrote that this jury was almost like a family. I mean, they were so close. Tell us a little bit about how those relationships developed and how they evolved over the course of the trial.
They bonded immediately from the time that they met back in the room, and they were all picked together on Tuesday of January. And they were prayerful. I believe I say this in my book. They were very perceptive, and they were just a pack. They stayed together. They treated each other like family. I could tell just from talking to the jurors about daily things, nothing about the trial at all. But I've been around a jury for a long time, different juries for a long time, and you get to know the layout of a jury, and just you can get a feel from how juries are going to be. And I learned that this jury, they were tight. They started every morning out with prayer. They were very watchful. They were very perceptive in the things that they were listening to, the things they were watching during the trial. especially when we went to Moselle at the very end of the trial. That was very telling. And just by observation, I knew that the verdict was already pretty sealed when we went to Moselle. There wasn't going to take much, and I knew it wasn't going to take long for them to come to a decision about a verdict.
All right, so look for that full interview with Becky Hill this coming week. We'll be dropping that full conversation. Check it out. And also, obviously, Behind the Doors of Justice. You can buy her book on Amazon there. Check that out. Great read, quick read. I enjoyed it. I think you will too. But as the Murdaugh case continues to move forward, look for us to follow not only the Laffitte sentencing hearing coming up this coming week, but also cases at the state level in Colleton County, cases before the statewide grand jury, federal charges, all that coming down the pike. And of course, the big civil lawsuit has been settled, but there remains an outrage suit and that ongoing battle between attorney Mark Tinsley and Savannah convenience store owner Greg Parker. Those two still doing battle on the civil side. That relates to the Murdaugh saga. We're going to be covering that too. FITSNews has been the very tip of the spear on all Murdaugh coverage from the very beginning, counting on us to continue to bring you all the breaking developments in this story and the context to make sense of them. All right, so in the last couple shows, we've been talking a little bit about FITSFILES, which is our brand new true crime and corruption podcast that we launched earlier this month. And so this week, wanted to give our audience a little bit of a taste of that new offering that we put together. And we started FITSFILES with one of the most just graphic, crazy, out of nowhere cases that we've ever covered, the Rose Petal murder. Now, this is a case out of Greer, South Carolina, a little suburb outside of Greer, the Canebrake subdivision, where on the morning of October 13, 2021, a positively gruesome crime took place. Christina Parcell, 41-year-old vet tech, was stabbed about the head and neck area 31 times by an individual with absolutely no known connections to her. A mystery that has baffled us, baffled law enforcement. Now, there's a trial coming in early 2024 for the accused killer in this Rose Petal murder. He's sitting in the Greenville County Detention Center right now. But as we've explored this case, the more we know, the less it adds up. The more information we get, the less sense any of it makes. And so as we have tried to dig into this story, our team, Dylan Nolan, Jen Wood, myself, Callie Lyons, our new researcher who's a big part of FITSFILES, we've been trying to figure out, again, deciphering meaning from these seemingly incongruent facts that make no sense. But this story, which is, again, quickly coming to a head, we're telling it both as it has happened and as it continues to unfold, which I think is one of the amazing things about FITSFILES. The other thing I love about this new format, it's not about us, not about egos, not about anything other than the facts of the case, the justice that's sought, and holding everyone involved, including us accountable. So I wanted to share real quick an excerpt from one of the episodes of our new format, our new podcast. You can get it on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you download podcasts. FITSFILES. Here's an excerpt from the Rose Petal murder. Clearly, none of this adds up. We have a phenomenally gifted musician, one generally regarded to be a good person, who volunteered to serve his country, who was seemingly on the cusp of greatness. He was welcomed with open arms into the Greenville community, a place people are flocking in droves to live and work. It makes no sense. How did it happen? How in the world did this kind, dutiful, prodigiously gifted young man, whom friends described as loyal with a big heart, how did he end up as the primary suspect in such a savage, seemingly senseless slaying? And not just that, the slaying of a woman with whom he had zero known connections. What could have possibly led Zach Hughes to stab Christina Parcell nearly 36 times in the head and neck, and then ritualistically pose her body around rose petals?
Investigators believe the mystery of Zach Hughes' involvement in this crime could be answered through an exploration of his relationship with John Mello, the father of Christina Parcells' young daughter. Christina and Mello had been embroiled in a contentious court battle for years over the custody of the young daughter they shared, which we'll be diving into in detail in later episodes. Mello, a self-described music producer, lived on the West Coast prior to moving to Greenville with his family 2 decades ago. It's not clear how he met Christina Parcell, but the custody battle for their young daughter began in earnest in 2016 and is continuing even after Parcell's death. According to investigators, Zachary Hughes worked for Mello, cleaning his house and performing other odd tasks, beginning in 2020 and continuing through the date of the murder. It is unknown how they met, but they both share a love of music. On October 5th, 2020, Mello took his young daughter with him to Italy in the midst of his ongoing custody battle with Christina, violating a court order. This led to criminal charges being filed against him for custodial interference in Greenville County. On October 21st, 2021, a year later and just a week after Christina's death, Mello returned to Greenville from Italy and was served a warrant for these charges and arrested. Upon being arrested in the Greenville County Detention Center, Mello listed Zachary Hughes on the relationship portion of his intake form, allowing the two of them to communicate while he was incarcerated. Mello also made an iPhone video with Hughes, giving him permission to retrieve his luggage and medication from the Charlotte airport following his arrest. How did authorities link Mello and Hughes?
All right, that is an excerpt from FITSFILES, our new true crime and corruption podcast. Again, not only can you get it on Apple, on Spotify, Google Podcasts, but right here. We're publishing these on our YouTube page. We want to maximize the audience for this and maximize the reach of this new offering, which I'm just very excited about the work we're doing there. Again, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or just watch it here on YouTube. FITSFILES, your new home for true crime, wherever you listen to podcasts. Great. All right, so we're going to dive into some politics for our last section. I know that everyone is just desperate to get into a lengthy discussion about the state of entitlement spending in America and the threats that it poses to the fiscal sustainability of our republic. I know I'm stoked about it. I mean, after hours of crime and courts and corruption, and yeah, let's dive in. But before we bore you to death with this, a couple really important numbers. And I want to talk about them because they lead into the politics that we're going to discuss. In 2022, Medicaid spent $1.07 trillion. That number is projected to grow to $2.2 trillion a year by 2033, a decade away. Similarly, Social Security, 2022, spent $1.16 trillion. That number projected to grow to $2.4 trillion per year, again, within the next decade. All told, we are looking at $29 trillion in new deficit spending for these programs within the coming decade. And we're in a country, by the way, where the debt is already $32.6 trillion. And I'll give you another big number, since we're talking about big numbers that'll never be paid back under any circumstances in any situation, which is going to lead to the default of our republic. But anyway, while we're talking about these big numbers, I'll throw another one at you, $78 trillion. It's current unfunded liabilities of those two programs I just mentioned. So yeah, we do need to talk about this. We do need to talk about this because a lot of folks retiring right now, they're going to be fine. But I'm screwed. Dylan Nolan behind our camera, 23, he's beyond screwed. My 7 kids, effed completely. And that's because for generations, politicians have made promises, haven't kept them. They have said they'll fix things, haven't done it. They've talked around the issue, or worse still, they've just refused to talk about it. Joe Biden, Donald Trump refused to talk about it. One candidate who has, to her credit, and we made a little fun of her on the show in the past, and obviously I got a little history we won't talk about. God knows what screenshot Dylan Nolan is putting up on the screen right now. For those of you watching the YouTube, I shudder to think. But Nikki Haley. I want to give some credit to Nikki Haley because the only major candidate running for president who has taken this bull by the horns and has said that we have to fix these broken entitlement systems is Nikki Haley. Now, do I trust her to do it? Do I trust her to actually follow through on her word? Hell no. But the conversation, we're in such a sad situation where having the conversation, literally, we've got to commend her for it. Because here's what happens. Haley started the conversation. And this month, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is in a much better position, polling, for now anyway, than Haley, he has said, you know what? Yeah, we do need to have a discussion on this. And it's the first time he said that. Because previously he was with Trump and he was with Biden saying, oh, no, it'll be fine. We don't have to touch it. But because of Haley's push, DeSantis and hopefully now other candidates in this election are going to start doing their job for change. Because again, people, it's boring to talk about. I get it. No one wants to rattle off numbers and prattle on about fiscal issues. But this is going to have a real world impact on people you love sooner rather than later. Because you cannot, as it turns out, borrow into oblivion without that check coming due at some point. And when interest payments on that huge debt that we keep talking about start eclipsing $1 trillion a year, that's when it becomes real. Because not only is that money that's going to get cut from your loved ones who are retiring, it's money that's going to get cut from things that we need to pay for today. So think about that and think about the politicians who are actually doing right on it, and credit where it's due to Nikki Haley for driving that important conversation. Now, we also want to talk about another prominent Palmetto politician this week. First, Congressional District Representative Nancy Mason. I'm laughing a little bit here. I go way back with Nancy as well. But there was an incident that took place. I say incident. It was a prayer breakfast. When you use the term incident and prayer breakfast together, you know something crazy is about to happen. But Nancy Mace was one of the many attendees at a prayer breakfast in Washington, D.C., hosted by U.S. Senator and presidential candidate Tim Scott. Now, this was a hugely attended event because Tim Scott's presidential campaign has moved out of the single digits in a couple early voting states. And Tim Scott is really on the cusp of becoming in that second tier with Ron DeSantis challenging Donald Trump. So this was a huge event, tons of cameras, and well, Nancy Mace was on time for the event. Nancy Mace spoke at the event. She spoke about why she was on time for the event, and let's just cut to this clip.
But want to thank you for pulling this together. Another year, another standing room only event. And when I woke up this morning at 7, I was getting picked up at 7:45. Patrick, my fiance, tried to pull me by my waist over this morning in bed. And I was like, no, baby, we don't got time for that this morning. I got to get to the prayer breakfast and I got to be on time, and a little TMI. But he can wait. I'll see him later tonight. But I was here early today for you, Tim. And I think everybody was here early for you today.
All right, so here's the equation we've got. Blue balls, prayer breakfast. Blue balls, prayer breakfast. Blue balls, prayer breakfast. Again, when do these worlds ever collide? Now, the craziest thing about the Mace situation is that basically it caused Republicans to have a Mitch McConnell moment. I'm sure that clip's playing right now. Yeah, everyone literally stroking out over the fact that Mace, gasp, is having premarital sex with her fiance. Apparently in the Republican Party, that is frowned upon. I don't know. I mean, we got Lindsey Graham up there doing God knows what, but a woman who's engaged can't have a little morning action, a little rise and shine. Got me, folks. But this was huge news. Our video, which we posted, again, we broke this story, and over 100,000, God knows how many views it's gotten now. But this story just dominated discussion in Washington, D.C., and it also played into that political calculus. And I want to talk about that real quick because, as you know, there's not just a presidential race going on. There's a debate and a contest and a conversation over who's going to be number 2. And over the last few months, Nancy Mace has very squarely entered that conversation. And the reason she's entered that conversation is that the folks down at Mar-a-Lago have recognized, by the way, they tried to take her out. Trump tried to take Nancy Mace out during the last Republican primary. She won. Not only that, she went on to win a swing district by 14 percentage points against a credible, well-funded Democratic rival who was running abortion ads against her nonstop with boatloads of money. So this was an unheard of victory for a Republican in a purple district that until as recently as 2 years ago had been held by the Democrats. Mace won a Democratic county, Charleston County, by 4.5%. She flipped 40% of Democratic precincts from her previous election, which she won by less than 2%. Again, turn that into a huge landslide. Of course, the folks in Mar-a-Lago are looking at her. Of course, DeSantis is looking at her. Anybody running for president is looking at her. Because if you look at how Joe Biden did in the last election with women, with suburban voters, 54, 55% respectively, those are huge numbers. And unless Republicans figure out a way to be competitive with those demographics, their luck in swing states ain't going to be so good. And Mace, or a candidate like Mace, could be key to that. Now, I personally believe the Republican nominee should think outside the box. Maybe pick somebody like former Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who would get all kinds of great independent traction, who would pick up libertarian support. That's what I would do. But again, Mace very squarely in that conversation. And by the way, there was some inquiry about where that footage from Mace came from, and it was actually from Tim Scott's office. So a lot of folks are wondering, hey, did they drop that video to maybe damage her politically? Who knows? We'll have to see. But a lot of movement on that political front in South Carolina this week. Moral of the story, folks, if you go to the prayer breakfast, well, here's actually the moral of the story. If you got a chance for that, just skip the prayer breakfast. Just skip it. But anyway, keep it tuned to FITSNews. We'll have our Palmetto Political Stock Index. I'm sure we'll be discussing some of these. That'll drop this weekend. But keep it tuned to FITSNews, where obviously we were breaking all the hottest Palmetto political news. All right, that's a wrap for this week's edition of the Week in Review. But before we go, a very special treat in the studio here for our outro is the CEO not only of the Folks household, raising all 7 of my unruly kids who come by their misbehavior, quite honestly, but also the CEO of FITSNews.com, literally running every aspect of our business, my lovely wife, Katrina Folks. Katrina, I got to ask you, that congressional blue ball section, is that something that I'm ever going to have to worry about?
After this segment, you might.
And on a very uncomfortable note, we will catch you on the next Week in Review. Was that good?